Welcome, fellow humans. I'm Heather Craig, clinical social worker and psychoanalyst, speaking to you from Raleigh, North Carolina. In this presentation, I will explore psychoanalytic self-state theory and illustrate its application to the treatment of painful dissociated states originating in childhood trauma. The full version of this talk will be published in Psychoanalytic Inquiry in 2023. Because it's so long, I will not present the whole paper. I'll leave out 2 long examples of work with my own patients, and I'll leave out a section of treatment recommendations. But if you'll write to me, I'd be happy to share the entire paper with you. I'll provide my email address on a slide at the end of the talk. What I hope you'll take away from this talk is an understanding of what is meant by a self-state in ordinary human experience, and to be able to use at least one metaphor that illustrates a psychoanalytic approach to working with dissociated self-states. Next slide. So for an overview, I'll introduce self-state theory and talk about dissociation in 2 forms. And I'll also talk about a house metaphor that I use in working with trauma. Then we'll have a 1 case example. I'm using myself as an example. And then a last section with treatment implications. Next slide. So what is a self-state? It's a body-mind felt sense of you that shifts fluidly as you move throughout the day. If you've spent any time with babies, you'll have noticed that they move through a variety of states as the day goes on. Even though babies don't have words yet, they certainly have an experience of themselves, a felt sense. Next slide. Take this little fellow. He's in a calm alert state, and that's the best one for learning and working. As he's fitting those pieces into the puzzle board, we can imagine he's feeling pretty good about himself. He's feeling effective and smart. Next slide. This little guy is ready to take on the world. He's feeling quite energetic. Next. And this one is wondering, what shall I do with those? She's open for learning and for experimenting. Next slide. And this one is ready to engage, ready to play. These 4 children, all in a calm, alert state, are not hungry, tired, or sick at the moment. They're in this ideal state because they have somebody in the background who is taking care of them and who's keeping an eye on them. They feel safe. Next slide. The supporting staff, the parents, provide essential help, enabling their babies to move smoothly from state to state by being with them sensitively as needed. Next slide. Here they are enjoying moments of fun, affection, and joy with their babies. Next slide. This baby is eating well with his mother, while this one, next, is not having it. So unreceptive is also a state. Next slide. This little kid is feeling a threat. Fortunately, his mother has his back, and so he is not going into all-out fear like this one. Next. Now the next slide, this one is fretful. Next slide. Lucky babies who have parents who respond promptly and sensitively when their babies are in a state they can't manage on their own, possibly heading off this state. Next slide. Crying. Now, all of us have states like this too. Lucky babies have parents who calmly offer assistance, enabling the baby to move from discomfort to comfort. After a feed in the rocking chair, for example, she might look like this. Next slide. And finally, this. Next slide. Settle down into sleep. One more slide. And daddy's asleep too. New slide. Just like babies, adults move through a variety of states each day. In relative health, this movement is fluid, and there is a sense that I can encompass all of my states. However, when a person has grown up with caregivers who are unpredictable, misattuned, or frightening, painful self-states may develop that are cut off and disowned as not me. These self-states hold painful memories and feelings that are sequestered within the personality as if in quarantine. My goal today is to present a psychoanalytic way of understanding and working with disowned, dissociated self states. This approach gradually enlarges our capacity to know what we know and feel what we feel, and so move toward a more whole way of being. You'll notice that I shift back and forth between speaking about our patients and speaking about you or us. That's because I'm talking about a human phenomenon that we all experience. I'll also use plain language today, just in the way I speak with my patients. This presentation is an attempt to translate an abstract psychoanalytic theory into something that anyone can understand. So, this talk is about trauma and how dissociation protects us from overwhelming pain. As you listen today, I would invite you to pay attention to your responses. Notice how you feel in your body, notice your emotions, and notice how well you're able to attend to what you see and hear. Now I'll speak about self states in psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalysis is like a mansion with many rooms, encompassing many different models of the mind. From Freud's early models, the most famous being the structural theory of id, ego, and superego, through the object relations theories, attachment theory, self psychology, relational and intersubjective approaches, and many other models. So, self state theory, the subject of the day, is a relatively recent addition to the psychoanalytic mansion. Developed primarily by psychoanalyst Philip Bromberg beginning in the 1990s, self state theory provides a different metaphor for how the mind is organized, and is particularly useful when working with trauma. Adopting this model does not require that you give up any of your other favorites. In fact, it's important to have multiple models of the mind. Nor does it require that you radically change your technique, although I will suggest some modifications. Rather, self state theory provides a different metaphor for how the mind is organized and is particularly useful when working with trauma. As you've already heard, a self state is a body mind felt sense of you. I think of it as a bundle of experience, including bodily sensations, memories, feelings, and patterns of relational expectations, what we call transference. You might be able to read a person's state by noticing his facial expression, posture, gesture, and tone of voice. Internally, however, the experience of a self state is more like an atmosphere or a mood. It will contain an experience of the body, for example, a sense of energy or lack of energy, or a sense of safety or fear. When a friend asks, "How's it going?" or "What's up?" they are asking you about your present self state. So here are a few familiar self states in adults. New slide. This one is after the breakup. You see this woman with a sad face, a slumped posture, perhaps having a sense of herself as ugly or worthless. There's a bleak atmosphere. Her energy is low, and there may be memories of early rejections that are evoked. New slide. And in this cartoon, we have Mouse, who is being rained on, which is how it feels when you're in a certain self state. Everything else can be fine, but you feel like you are being personally rained on. New slide. Now we have Gene Kelly, wildly in love. He is smiling. He has an upright posture. He has making an expansive gesture, even though he's being rained upon. He's in a euphoric mood. He has high energy. He's feeling attractive, and probably memories of being valued are alive. Next slide. Self states in adults are much more complex than those in babies, primarily because adults have many memories associated with each state built up over a lifetime. And also because we have laid down expectations about how the other person, will respond to each of our states, built upon repetitive early experiences. For example, as a crying baby, we may have been held with tenderness and concern. And so as adults, we feel accepting of ourselves when we're upset, and we expect others to respond with kindness as well. But some babies have been handled brusquely and with resentment. Some are even told, I'll give you something to cry about. It makes sense that our history with the way others have responded to our distress will be part of the self state bundle when we are currently in pain. Bear in mind, not all self states are bad. We saw wildly in love, we saw calm and alert, playful, joyful. However, as therapists, we tend to concern ourselves with the painful ones. But positive states should not be ignored or taken for granted. And I'll come back to that idea later. Now I'll speak for a moment about dissociation and how it relates to self-state theory. New slide. Dissociation means to break connection and is from the Latin, to break apart that which is joined. And I'm going to speak about dissociation in two ways. New slide. First, as an ordinary defense mechanism, and second, as a process that structures or segments the personality, keeping traumatic self states in quarantine. So these are the two functions of dissociation. Starting with the first sense of the term, as with any defense mechanism, denial, rationalization, intellectualization, etc., defense mechanisms work to protect our mind from feelings or realizations that are overwhelming, dangerous, or bad. So as with all defenses, dissociation works unconsciously and it occurs automatically. New slide. For those of you who are students of psychoanalytic theory, the concept of dissociation has a slippery past, going all the way back to Pierre Janet in the 1890s. And this history has been detailed in a book by Ira Brenner, published in 2001. So, as a defense mechanism, dissociation has a few distinct qualities. Next slide. First, it works by separating thoughts from feelings. We all do this quite often. When our child is hurt, for example, we hold our feelings together for the child's sake. The capacity to separate thoughts and feelings enables a pilot to make an emergency landing without crying or screaming. Next, second, dissociation as a defense works by separating mind from body. For example, a person who is being raped may observe the assault from high above. Another may experience the assault as happening to the body, but not to the mind or the self. Third, it works by distorting our ability to perceive accurately or even think clearly. As we approach a dreadful topic, one of my patients notices that I become fuzzy and that she cannot hear what I'm saying. Fourth, you may notice a spaced out or absent quality in which the mind appears to be disconnected from what is happening, as if the person cannot bear to realize what is happening. Now, you might think about the young boy in the movie Moonlight. Whenever he enters his apartment, he never knows what he's going to find. Will his mother be there happy to greet him? Will she be passed out on the couch? Will she be with a man? Will there are televisions that have been sold and an empty space there? When he enters the apartment, though, the camera goes fuzzy, kind of to illustrate his sense of dread and really dissociation as he enters his home. Dissociation is particularly radical defense and tends to be employed when our lives are threatened or when the integrity of our mind is threatened. It is a defense of last resort, which protects us from psychic disintegration, from losing your mind. I mean, think Winnicott. A child may dissociate, for example, when the parent whom she needs for love and protection is the same person who is frightening her, as in disorganized attachment. She may resort to dissociation because to realize her situation, to know it, to feel it, would shatter her mind. Dissociation provides an escape where there is no escape. Next slide. As with all defenses, dissociation serves a highly protective and adaptive function. It helps us to survive terrible things and to go on with our lives. It enables us to be brave, to walk into battle, to work in an ER. On the downside, it keeps us in the dark about our feelings, thoughts, and experiences. Next slide. I'm going to speak now for a moment about trauma. The word trauma is from the Greek, meaning wound. In the psychological sense, psychic trauma refers to an experience which has an emotionally unbearable quality. It's not the event itself which is the trauma, but rather the way in which the event is experienced. New slide. There are always two ingredients to a psychic trauma. One, a difficult or life-threatening event, which in Greek, trauma means wound. And two, the lack of sensitive human support for the person who is experiencing the event. There's only one mind there to hold the experience, where there should be two minds to hold and digest what has just happened. For example, you might fall and break your leg while riding your bike, and that's not a great thing to happen, but would not necessarily constitute a psychic trauma, unless perhaps you were struck by a car whose driver speeds away, or darkness falls and no one comes to help, or your parents are angry because your broken leg is causing them expense and inconvenience. Notice how the emphasis shifts from the physical broken leg to the emotional sense of being discarded, alone, resented, or worthless. Next slide. Regarding trauma, another important distinction is single incident trauma versus pervasive or chronic trauma. Single incident trauma might be a life-threatening car accident, while pervasive trauma might refer to being in a war zone for years where there is no safe place, or being a child in a home in which parents are unpredictably frightening and there's no safe place, no protection. My focus today is on treating the sequelae of pervasive or chronic trauma in childhood. So swinging back now to dissociation, I promised that I would speak about that term in two ways. In the first sense, as an ordinary defense mechanism, and in the second, as a structuring process that segments the personality. I'm going to illustrate the concept of structural dissociation using the handy metaphor of a house. My understanding of structural dissociation has been informed primarily by the work of psychoanalyst Philip Bromberg. I can remember reading his first book, Standing in the Spaces, and wondering, what is he getting at? But as with studying any new psychoanalytic theory, one must tolerate feeling bewildered. You must spend some time trying it on for size, like a garment, and thinking about how it might fit on you or on your patients. In Bromberg's second book, Awakening the Dreamer, a chapter bears the title, A House Need Not Be a Person Need Not Be a House to Be Haunted. This is borrowed from a poem by Emily Dickinson. Inspired by that image, I came up with a metaphor that captures, for me, how dissociation works to structure the personality by putting traumatic experiences and painful self states into quarantine. So here's the metaphor. Next slide. The person, whoops, one more. The person, you, are a house with a nice big open first floor and a few rooms in the basement. When things are going well, you're living on the first floor. You move through various rooms, through various self states, like the babies we saw earlier. In relative health, we move smoothly between self states, just like we walk from one room to another in the house. We can even visit the basement, but come back upstairs readily. However, if you're a person with unmetabolized trauma, you may find yourself occasionally feeling quite terrible, not knowing why, and not able to move yourself out of this negative state. Next slide. What has happened? You have dropped into a room in the basement. And what is down there? In the self-state model, unmetabolized trauma is stored in the basement. Now, unmetabolized could mean undigested, raw, not symbolized in words or not verbalized, not yet in story form, or unformulated experience. There's a lot of different ways to describe what unmetabolized or unformulated experience is. Traumatic memories, whether explicit or implicit, of being hurt and unsupported are stored in the basement. It's very handy generally to have them shut away like that so they don't interfere too much with your daily life. And really, who wants to deal with that stuff or feel it? Despite our best efforts to avoid painful states, what happens that sends us down into the basement? And how do we get out of there? As I worked with my patients to understand self state theory, the memory of a game from childhood emerged. Next slide. Here's the cover of the game, Chutes and Ladders. How many of you played that game as children? Next slide. Well, if you haven't played it, you throw a dice and you move around the board. And if you land on a square, say square number 40, you move up the board and closer to your goal. However, if you land on a square like number 98, you slide down the board to 78 and move farther away from your goal. Now, I've got to thank my sister-in-law, Paula Craig, for these illustrations. So, next slide. So we added to the house a chute, like a laundry chute, on which you can slide down into the basement, as well as a ladder that you can use to climb up and out. You can simply describe the house to your patient or draw it on a notepad, even if you have no talent. Next slide. You see what I mean? This is my drawing. Okay. So the idea is that dissociated experiences are stored in the basement to keep them from upsetting us. This is structural dissociation. But it's not a perfect system. The stuff is still lurking down there, haunting us. Next slide. As in this New Yorker cartoon. Look at his eyes slanting over toward repressed memories. The stuff is still lurking down there, haunting us. And this is often why people come to therapy. They get stuck in the basement, or they are avoiding whole activities that remind them of what is down there. Or stuff is seeping up from the basement like a bad smell. Next slide. So staying with the house metaphor, as we go through our day, something may evoke the experience in the basement. A difficult encounter with someone, a photograph, or a dream. We call this a trigger. A character in a movie reminds you of your raging father, a trigger. Think of it as causing a trap door to swing open in the floor. Next thing you know, you're sliding down the chute into the basement, and you are alone. And if this room has never been worked, it is generally dark, and the door is locked, the windows are painted shut, and it's full of boxes, spider webs, and old junk, and we're stuck. There's a chute, but no ladder. We can readily relate the self-state model to the diagnosis of PTSD. The house metaphor captures both sides. The intrusive pole, that's what happens when a person hits a trigger and slides down the chute, besieged by disturbing memories and sensations. Or the pole of numbness or avoidance. That's when structural dissociation is working for you. That whole part of your experience is sealed off in the basement in quarantine. It requires a lot of psychic energy to lock down a part of yourself, and that part feels dead or numb. The role of the therapist is to accompany her patient into the basement to help with sorting out the contents, boxes of memories, for example, and to digest what is in there. That's the bulk of our daily work as therapists and requires the full range of therapeutic skill. But I would add the therapist should also assist the patient with building a ladder to come out. And that's most important. I'll come back to the important role of the ladder in the last section. Next slide. To put some meat on the bones of the theory you just heard, I'll present a case example from my own life that illustrates the two ways in which dissociation operates. One as an ordinary defense mechanism, and two as a process that quarantines a cluster of traumatic experiences into a room in the basement, which I'll refer to as the dead sister room. New slide. I was the first of three children. My sister Dawn was born exactly 1 year after me, and then my brother Vincent came a year and a half after her. My sister died when she was 6 years old, and I was 7. The three of us had chicken pox, and she developed a high fever. She was rushed to the hospital, left there alone overnight, and just before my parents arrived for visiting hours the next morning, she died. 6 years old. When my parents returned from the hospital without her, they explained that she would not be living with us anymore. She had gone to live with God in heaven. And that, amazingly, after that, no one ever spoke to us about her death. The adults cried and received visitors, but my brother and I were treated as though we had no feelings or thoughts about her, as though we were bystanders, as if nothing had happened to us. If we think about the basement, everything that I felt was boxed up and put down there, allowing me to go to school, have friends, and appear to be quite normal. So, what do you imagine was down there in those boxes? One big box contained a gnawing sense of guilt. This is the only feeling that I might have admitted to at the time, if anyone had bothered to speak to me about her. I had felt deep resentment against my sister, quite put upon. Next slide. I mean, literally, look at this picture. I wasn't allowed to beat her up, but my hostility was real and was expressed primarily through contempt. I thought she was quite stupid. And after she died, I felt terrible about all the times we argued or I had outsmarted her. Another box in the basement was packed with outrage. When Roman Catholic people die, typically the funeral home issues a holy card. Next slide. On Dawn's holy card, there's the image of a guardian angel watching over two children. I can still remember receiving this card and thinking, and where was her guardian angel? Not only was I angry, but my worldview was cracking. I had been taught, if you were good, God would protect you. Next slide. Another box contained fear, the realization that my parents had failed to keep her safe. They left her in the hospital alone. Can you imagine anything more frightening for a 6-year-old? Why would they do that? Were they simply careless? Did they want to offload one of their children? Was she too worthless to protect? Could this happen to me? At 7 years old, it's really hard to say how much I could have put these feelings into words, even with support. Recall that the presence of an attuned person is necessary to metabolize terrible events. For me, the worst loss was that my poor mother turned quite gray after Dawn died. She was only 28 years old, but she lost her former sense of joy and engagement with us. Instead, she had daily headaches and backaches, and we can only imagine her suffering. But from my point of view, my mother, the only person I might have turned to, was essentially lost as well. 2 months later, my father was in an accident that put him in the hospital for 6 months. As this occurred at the end of the school year, my mother sent my brother and me away to live with relatives for the summer. So that's an important detail. So here comes a description of what dissociation can look like as a simple mechanism of defense. On the first day of 3rd grade, I was assigned to write a paragraph about my summer vacation for my homework, the first writing assignment of my entire life. And this was right after the summer when I'd been sent away after my sister died and I was in the hospital for 6 months. I sat at the dining room table to do my work, but found that I had absolutely nothing to say. It was as if my brain had been sucked right out of my skull. So I began to wail, and my mother rushed in. And she listened for a moment and then said, "Heather Ann, don't be silly. You know perfectly well what you did this summer. You stayed at your uncle's house. You played with your cousins, you went swimming, you read 3 Nancy Drew mysteries. Now stop crying and write that down. And so I did. But from then on, whenever I was faced with a writing assignment, I would have that same terrible feeling. There was nothing in my head to write, no ideas, nothing. So this story illustrates a few points. How dissociation was working, unconsciously, of course, to protect me from knowing what I knew and to protect me from feeling what I felt. All of that guilt, loss, outrage, and fear. It also demonstrates how traumatic experiences can become unconsciously associated with a typically neutral activity like writing. Further, it created a deficit in my development. I avoided writing to avoid feeling that terrible sensation of emptiness. But I never connected my dread of writing to my sister's death until I was nearly 40 years old and in psychoanalysis. Now for an example of what dissociation looks like when it creates segmentation in the personality. Rooms in the basement that are locked up tight. New slide. When my own daughter was nearly the same age as Dawn, she also got chickenpox. I was home alone with her for a week because my husband was traveling. And the strange thing was, I didn't tell anyone what was going on. I didn't call a friend, a family member, or even my analyst. Until the end of the week when a colleague called to check on me because I'd missed work. And I was able to say to him that my daughter was sick with chickenpox and that my sister died of chickenpox near the same age. After a stunned silence, he said, "You've been alone all week with this?" And even I realized at that moment that this was pretty strange behavior to have isolated myself in that way. 2 days later, once my daughter was well, I described what had happened to my analyst. And for the first time in my life, in my late 30s, I was able to put together the knowledge that my sister had died with my feelings about her death. I remember that moment. It was like 2 locomotives crashing into each other right inside my head. It was so painful. Next slide. So, with this example, I wish to highlight that dissociation protects us from unbearable pain. And it persists until the time when we feel supported enough to bear it. And even then, this meeting of feeling and knowledge can be excruciating. It can feel like your mind will shatter. So, for the last section of this talk, I'll talk about treatment. Treatment of trauma is a vast and complex subject. I mean, there are many great things written about it. And I would encourage you to read Bromberg's writings, among the best descriptions of psychoanalytic relational work. I'll try to stick to the self-state model and the house metaphor as we think about treatment. The house metaphor is useful because it lends a structure to trauma treatment that anyone can understand. The house metaphor can organize the work. Now you're feeling okay on the first floor. Now it sounds like you've been triggered. I wonder what happened. Now we're working together in the basement. Now we're practicing steps on the ladder. And because there may be more than one room in the basement, it's a good idea to give them each a name. The loser room, the envy room, the fear room. I have 3. Bromberg writes that negative self-states are most easily recognized when states are shifting. That was hard to understand for a while. But I translate this to mean you can see that you've been in a bad state once you begin to feel a bit better. You can notice the sliding in and climbing out when there's some movement. You can begin to identify triggers that send you down the chute. For me, the most difficult time in treatment is when my patient and I are in a dark room together, and it feels like we've always been there and always will be. You know, depression can feel that way. But if you do the work of witnessing, of listening with empathy and curiosity, if you earn some trust, then one day there will be a laugh between you, or a useful dream, or a metaphor will arise. And then the whole therapy seems to lift and states begin to move. So the house metaphor has its limitations, of course. People are not houses. I recently explained this idea to a Buddhist teacher, and he questioned me, where is this house in relation to the community? So this metaphor certainly has its limits. But he did make me think, what about the other spaces in the house? What about making additions to the house? A patio, a porch, an art studio, representing positive new states. What about adding windows and skylights to the second floor, representing higher states of being? In my experience, therapists spend a lot of time working in the basement. We work with negative transference. We work with negative projections, right? That's junk in the room that doesn't belong to you and never did. We work with self hatred, with bad moods. But are we sufficiently interested in the building of new and better states? I had an experience in my 20s with my first therapist. I was quite depressed. And after some months, I came in and spoke about a really good weekend where I actually felt good and had some fun. And after I described it for a few minutes, he said, well, we're not really here to discuss that, like the good stuff. And even then, not knowing much, I thought, well, that was a mistake because this is really where we want me to be. So this is why I chose the image of Chagall's fiddler on my title slide. Next slide. The fiddler's playing music on the roof, overlooking the town, where generations have suffered from starvation, pogroms, and the death of untold numbers of children. Even so, he has found a way to rise up to the roof, scratching out a pleasant, simple tune while keeping his balance. This is from the prologue to Fiddler on the Roof. It's important for therapists to keep the whole life of the person in mind, beyond his depression and beyond her trauma. And even though your patient may feel that he has always lived in a dark basement, you must keep the whole house in mind, with all of that space waiting to be occupied upstairs. New slide. I promised I would get back to the image of the ladder, which represents the way out of a traumatic self state. The ladder represents a set of skills for shifting states. Next slide. As you know, a ladder is composed of many rungs, and the set of rungs for a particular person's ladder will be unique and custom made. So here's how to work with a ladder. Imagine that your patient spontaneously reports an activity that made her feel better. She went for a hike on Saturday. So you highlight that experience. Being in nature helped her shift her state a bit, even if it was only a 5% shift. This experience should be identified as a rung on her ladder. You call it nature, or walking, hiking. Often the ladder has to be intentionally built in therapy, meaning the therapist may need to ask the patient to notice what experiences make her feel better or worse. Some friends, for example, are downers, while others are encouraging or make you laugh. Certain movies are disturbing, while others make you feel inspired. We almost always have a choice about what we put into ourselves, about what we consume. And learning how to make small shifts in state by choice can add up to a big skill in moving out of bad states. So a new slide. There are many possible rungs on a ladder, each one involving a skill or a choice. And remember, by definition, when one is traumatized, one feels helpless and overwhelmed. So the sense of choice is extremely important to highlight in treatment. So let's look at a few of the possible steps on the ladder. I've got number one is moving your body, walking, running, dancing, jumping rope, juggling. It's good for everything, right? For your overall health. We know that. But it's also a powerful antidote to states of helplessness and passivity. So rather than simply prescribing exercise for your depressed patient, explain that exercise will help your patient shift her state, maybe 5%. Have her notice how she feels before and after moving. The next rung, create, make something, fix something, grow something like flowers or vegetables. Making things also mediates against helplessness, and creating beauty mediates against the feeling of being ruined. A third step I've got listed as regulate. Learn to regulate your autonomic nervous system. Traumatized people almost always suffer dysregulation, which can look like being either perpetually vigilant or on high alert, like that's called high sympathetic tone, or always lethargic, depressed, collapsed when the parasympathetic branch is dominant. So, breath work, yoga, Tai Chi, meditation are all potent practices for regulating the nervous system. Placing them in the context of shifting states gives them a psychoanalytic framework. Okay. The next rung on the ladder is connecting with others. Traumatized people have suffered in isolation, and they may have highly negative expectations of others. So you can encourage making contact with people, even if that means at first getting a pet or reading in the library rather than reading alone. One of my friends led groups for Korean vets at the VA. And, the typical therapy group where you talk about your bad experiences did not go anywhere with them. And so they changed the theme of the group to telling jokes and drinking coffee. And the vets loved it, never missed, and their depression all improved. Next, participate in harmonious group activities. Singing in a chorus, playing in an orchestra, dancing with a group, drumming in a circle. They all foster a sense of interpersonal harmony by entraining the nervous system while not making demands for verbal interaction. The next rung is really important. Consume with care. What we put into ourselves, what we read, watch on TV, or see it at the movies can have a great impact on our state. If you're not already not feeling well, care should be exercised to avoid stimuli that will tilt your state toward anxiety or depression. Consume instead images and stories that are humorous or inspiring. The next rung on my ladder is listen to music. I don't know of a more potent agent for changing your state. You can just think of it. Think of how you feel when you listen to Mozart, or the Beatles. I'm dating myself. Your favorite music. Some of it will make you feel more lively, and some kinds of music will make you feel calm. So you can actually prescribe the kind of music you listen to how you want your state to shift. And notice the impact on your body. The next one on my ladder is what room? ? Name the room you're in. That's a rung on the ladder. So, for example, if my husband's running late to get home from work, I can be thrown in a second into the dead sister room. So, if I can name that room, I can say, oh, yeah, it helps me realize that I am in the realm of memory, right? I've just dropped into a very bad old memory, but nothing bad is actually happening right now. So naming the room I've been dropped helps me just actually distinguish myself from the room. I'm not so identified with it. Next rung up is know your triggers. They're different for everyone. That's a rung on the ladder. What just happened? What threw me down here? You can become very familiar with what triggers you. It was that scene in the movie I saw last night. We call this self-analysis. And just to be able to name it, it makes you feel less helpless. Next one up, what age are you? You can move up one step on the ladder by simply asking, how old do I feel now? Oh, I feel like I'm 6. But how old am I actually? Well, I'm 55. I mean, no one is going to scream at me like that now, even if I do make a mistake. So this is like uncoupling the past and the present. Almost by definition, if you've slid into a bad self-state room, you are in the realm of the past. So it really helps to be able to have the skill to distinguish that. On my top rung, I've got call for help or call your therapist. This ability should not be taken for granted. Remember how I had isolated myself at home with a sick child? To learn how to call for help is to break out of isolation. You no longer have to suffer quietly alone. Just remembering that you can call your therapist can move you up on the ladder one step. And we all know that once we have an appointment on the books, we start to feel better just knowing that we're going to speak to our therapist soon. So these steps on the ladder are best built from your patient's own experiences, having them observe what makes them feel better and actually highlighting those for them. I mean, you can actually write them down just like this on a ladder if you like. So building a sturdy ladder is not the cure for developmental trauma. Now that typically requires years of skillful psychodynamic care. But if climbing each rung, right, if developing those skills makes you feel a bit better, maybe just 5% better, and there are 10 rungs, that could get you feeling 50% better and make you feel that your state is, to some degree, under your own control. Next slide. There are many implications for treatment that I cover in the full version of this paper. I believe it's important to convey to your patients that therapy cannot erase traumatic life experiences. The rooms in the basement never go away, but your relationship to trauma can change. Boxes can be sorted, organized. Sensations can be connected to real events, and shame can be released. Junk deposited in the room by others via projection can be ejected. You can learn to bear the sensations and feelings associated with trauma and so be less avoidant. When you're triggered into the basement, you can know where you are. You're familiar with this part of yourself. It is no longer not me, right? Just cut off from you. You can have a compassionate attitude toward your own fear. You can become adept with the ladder. You can move in and out of the basement fluidly and with more confidence. And that's what I mean by moving into wholeness. You're never completely rid of the residue of trauma, but you know how to move, and you're moving in a good direction. Next slide. Last thoughts. Everything we do as therapists rests on our own sanity. It rests on our ability to bear strong emotion and not turn away. It rests on our ability to feel strong emotion and still think clearly. In my experience, most therapists have some kind of early relational trauma, not necessarily mistreatment, but certainly misattunement by parents who are suffering. And so I want to encourage young therapists, particularly, to do your own work. Any bit of pain that you transform, any understanding earned in your own treatment will be immediately available for the benefit of your patients. I mean, you can put it to work in your office tomorrow. And even though your patients may know nothing about your life, your confidence and optimism that real healing is possible will be conveyed to them. So, do your own work. Do your own work. Thank you. And here is my email if you'd like to request the full paper. Next slide. This talk was given as part of the Seasoned Clinicians Notebook series, illustrating how psychoanalytic ideas can inform the practice of psychotherapy. The Psychoanalytic Center of the Carolinas, also known as the PCC, is a nonprofit mental health organization. When you visit our website, there's the link. Please note the tab, Find a Therapist, about our free psychoanalytic referral service. Under the Education tab, you'll see that we offer a great variety of study groups, short programs like this one, and a number of 8 to 16-week courses. We offer, in fact, the only postgraduate training programs in psychodynamic psychotherapy and psychoanalysis in the Carolinas. Membership in the PCC is open to mental health practitioners and to others who share an interest in psychoanalysis. Finally, the PCC trains leaders in Circle of Security Parenting, an international program based in attachment research that builds secure parent child relationships. Please consider making tax deductible gifts to support the PCC, ensuring that therapies of depth, insight, and relationship are always taught and practiced in the Carolinas. Thank you for listening.